Sometimes you have members of Congress who are, in their districts participating in hearings, and they get disconnected, or the screen freezes. You have some members of Congress who live in areas that really have a really poor internet connection. It makes it challenging. You have some members of Congress, again, who are just not used to technology. I mean, we have some members who are just, this is scary. They don't feel comfortable with this, and you can tell because they're a little bit uneasy in conducting hearings or participating in hearings. But the more you do it, I mean, the old saying, practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the more you increase your comfort level.
It's wonderful to see you all again. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. This is a 9-series course that we're running as a novel course in Suffolk University, and we are inviting you, the public, to join us inside the classroom and furthering the historic mission of Suffolk University, which is of access and opportunity for everyone. So a big thank you for all of you who are joining us. We hope you have lots of questions and that you enjoy tonight's broadcast. The topic that we're going to delve into today is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on governance, particularly governance at the national level here in the United States. And we are thrilled to have with us Congressman Jim McGovern, Democrat from the 2nd District of Massachusetts, who is also a very good friend of Suffolk and chair of the House Rules Committee, which means he knows what's going on in terms of what impact this is having on Congress. I want to take a little bit of time to explain how deep a relationship Congressman McGovern has with Suffolk University. And that relationship really began when he was a staffer for Congressman Joseph Moakley, who was a graduate of Suffolk University Law School and whose archives are now housed in our library, along with some of a very young Jim McGovern's papers, he served as a staffer for Congressman Moakley for a long time. And I think I'm not overstepping boundaries in saying that Congressman Moakley was a mentor and a friend to Congressman McGovern. And I have heard him say before that he has taken many of his cues about how to govern from what he learned by serving for a long time with Congressman Moakley. And one of the issues that Mr. McGovern and Congressman Moakley dealt with early on in Jim's congressional career as a staffer was foreign relations in the Northern Triangle of Central America. At the time, there was a sizable population of El Salvadoran asylum seekers and refugees who were living in Congressman Moakley's district. And they were here in the Boston area looking for refuge from conditions that were horrendous in El Salvador. And Congressman Moakley and Mr. McGovern were very instrumental in 2 different ways. One, in bringing to light and investigating what was at the time a horrific murder of Jesuit priests in El Salvador and investigating what happened with that. And also later on in developing a program that we refer to today as TPS, or Temporary Protected Status. So it's a really important piece of legislation that deals with immigration that has been used to provide temporary asylum for predominantly victims of natural disasters or horrific conditions in their home countries. Now, undoubtedly, immigration is a topic that is alive and well on the agenda today. So this is something that I also would like to spend some time talking to Congressman McGovern about. Because of these connections, Congressman McGovern has been incredibly generous with his time, both with us here today and when we bring students to Washington and coming to Suffolk University. So first, Jim, I want to thank you for taking the time once again to be in front of Suffolk students and a wider audience. And the first question I want to ask you is, what has been the impact of the COVID pandemic on the day-to-day functioning of Congress?
First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm a big fan of Suffolk for a lot of reasons, and you mentioned some of them. My association with Joe Moakley, and I always enjoy meeting Suffolk students and faculty in person, but unfortunately, due to what we're dealing with, that's not possible right now. And in answer to your question, I mean, Congress has been impacted like every other sector of society. We're not supposed to gather in large numbers together. We're supposed to follow the medical protocols like everybody else is. And that's been a challenge because Congress's rules are kind of old and arcane, and they don't envision us dealing with life in a pandemic. But it has been a challenge because we've had to find ways to operate remotely, not just for the safety of members of Congress, but more importantly for the safety of our staff and all those who work in Congress. And so we've come up with new rules and procedures that allow us to do hearings remotely, and we even established a way to vote for members who can't get to Washington by proxy. So it's been challenging, but we've been dealing with it.
Yeah, well, it's the professor in me, but I actually prepared a slide which kind of outlines the bullet points of what a new rules package that you developed and passed looks like. So we're going to put that up on screen, and you can publicly correct me if I got any of these points wrong, and tell us a little bit about maybe what's most important or most surprising about how these rules have functioned. And the last thing I would say is that these are historic rules, right, or historic rules changes, because they were hard fought, with the presumption being that members must be present to conduct business.
Right. Yeah, so any changes to procedure in Congress are always controversial. We vote electronically, and because there's 435 of us, so the old way of voting, which everybody voted individually, took forever. So we moved to electronic voting. That was controversial. We had members of Congress, and we had different organizations oppose that because they said it would be a violation of the Constitution. Members technically wouldn't be voting in person, but we made that change years ago. We have cameras now that live stream our proceedings. That was a controversial reform that Congress made. We did it because people ought to know what's happening in the Congress. And so similarly, these suggested changes were met with a lot of resistance because people said, oh, you have to be present. But the Constitution really does not say that you have to be physically present in one place in order to be able to conduct business. And that we've never done hearings like we're having this conversation now. People objected to that. So anyway, the slide that you show is basically describes some of the changes that we've made, and they were a little bit controversial. But having said that, it allows Congress to continue to do its business, which is important because we need to pass bills, emergency bills, to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to have to pass appropriations bills to keep the government running. There are emergencies that happen. We have to pass a defense authorization bill, and so we have to figure out a way to operate in this safe and orderly fashion. And these are the rules that we came up with. And I would just say that since they've been enacted, they've actually been implemented, fairly smoothly, which is a relief. Some of the challenges that we have is that we have some members of Congress who are, I'm going to try to put this nicely, who are just older, right? Who still use flip phones, who having a virtual conversation is something they never do. So getting used to the technology, has been interesting to watch. But I've helped them, get the appropriate support staff so they can practice and be able to move forward. But these rules have essentially allowed us to be able to operate in the middle of this pandemic when some people just cannot get to Washington.
Okay. Well, I actually, when I was doing a little bit of research and reading through this, I was surprised to learn that you had to add some rules about decorum. So I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you how that came about.
Well, for example, we have a dress code on Congress. Right now, if I were in a hearing, I'd be violating decorum because I'm not in a sport coat and tie. But we had what we wanted to do is say the way you operate in person is the way you should operate remotely. So if I'm chairing a committee, we have a dress code, and I have to conduct myself in a certain way. And I can't, swear at people, even though I might want to, but I can't. But basically, what we're saying is the way the rules of decorum that govern your behavior while you're on the floor in committee have to be the same rules that govern you when you operate virtually, and that includes dress code too.
Okay. Well, that makes an awful lot of sense. And actually, we do have, I'd like you to kind of unpack what proxy voting looks like, what the procedure is, because I know that that was one of the largest sticking points. And we actually have a little bit of C-SPAN footage. So thank goodness that 40 years of C-SPAN have given us a library of vision into this. But we do have a clip of you casting a proxy vote that we're going to play now.
As the member designated by Mr. Welsh of Vermont pursuant to H.Res. 965, I will inform the House that Mr. Welsh will vote nay on the amendment on block number 6.
That's not terribly dramatic, but the bottom line is Peter Welsh of Vermont asked me to be his proxy. And so he has to inform me on an official device how he's going to vote. And it can't be, just vote whatever way you want me to vote, or vote with the democratic way or whatever. On every single vote, he has to tell me, every procedural vote, every substantive vote, how he's going to vote. I get that on my official device. I go to the floor. I announce publicly how Mr. Welsh of Vermont will vote. I then go to the well of the House. I fill out a card that says, Peter Welsh of Vermont votes aye by proxy. I hand that to the clerk, and then it is announced again how Peter Welsh of Vermont voted. So for those who criticize this, they say, this is a backroom deal and no one's going to know how anybody voted. As you can see, that's just the first part of that's like the second part of a multi-part procedure. It is very, very transparent. And so I can't vote the way I think Peter Welsh wants. He has to let me know. If he doesn't give me instructions, I can't vote for him. But that's how it goes. And so for those members who, for whatever reason, some members live in areas that have been heavily impacted by the pandemic, or they have health issues of their own that they can't travel. This has enabled them to continue to represent their constituents. And I think it's a good change. I don't want this to be the way Congress changes permanently, because I do think Congress should operate in person, when that is possible again. And I don't want to change the nature of Congress, but in unique circumstances like a pandemic, this is one way we can operate in a safe way, in an orderly way, and in a transparent way.
Right, and to be certain, the rule only lasts, if I'm correct, for 45 days, and then has to be renewed, and it also ends at the end of the 116th. So it is
right. So if a future Congress doesn't ever want to do this, they don't have to do it. But I do think that it is, again, it has functioned in a way that I think most observers believe, is respectful of the institution, allows us to do our business, is transparent. And so my guess is that my prediction would be that future Congresses would retain this in case there's another situation similar to the one we're going through now.
Okay, and one last question about sort of how procedure has changed. You have to practice social distancing. There are, assuming a full Congress, 435 members of Congress, and instead of all gathering elbow to elbow on the floor of the House to conduct votes, you now have to. Now, what are you doing? I guess is the question.
we vote in groups. I'm in group 4, but I mean, so groups of about 50 members at a time go on the House floor, who are present and cast their vote, or cast their votes and sometimes announce the proxies of other members who aren't there. So it takes time. And then after the votes, a vote series, they clean the chamber and get ready for the next vote. So, it's taking about an hour and a half or longer for each vote. So it's long, but look, we want to follow the best advice of the medical experts. We want to follow the advice of the attending physician, and that is what they have recommended. So, and the same with committee hearings, by the way. One of the reasons why I want to do virtual committee hearings is because most committee hearing rooms in Congress are not gigantic. I mean, I'm the chair of the Rules Committee. We're a relatively small committee, right? And yet, the only committee we could operate in safely was the Ways and Means Committee, which is one of the biggest committees rooms in the Congress. And when we had a hearing there, we took up the whole room. So the Ways and Means can't operate in that committee room. The Transportation Committee, which has dozens and dozens and dozens of members, cannot operate in the Transportation Committee room. So, operating virtually really is saving the committee process during this pandemic.
And has it been a pretty easy transition for committee members, or have there been challenges? And I'll also say, I mean, coming from higher ed, we're facing exactly these same issues. How do you put students in a classroom? How do you do these things?
Yeah. I mean, it has gone mostly okay, but there are challenges. I mean, technology isn't perfect. I mean, you talked about a lightning storm, about to pass through where you are right now. That could affect our connection here. So, sometimes you have members of Congress who are, in their districts participating in hearings, and, they get disconnected, or the screen freezes. You have some members of Congress who live in areas that really have a really poor internet connection. It makes it challenging. You have some members of Congress, again, who are just not used to technology. I mean, we have some members who are just, this is scary. I mean, they don't feel comfortable with this, and you can tell because they're a little bit uneasy in conducting hearings or participating in hearings. But the more you do it, I mean, the old saying, practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the more you increase your comfort level. And I think, so we had a few committees that had a little bit of a rough start, but I think now, they're into the groove a little bit, and I think they're doing okay. So, but those have really been the only challenges. I mean, some Republicans have complained that that the chairs are not recognizing them, whereas in an in-person committee you can't help but recognize somebody. But we're working those kinks out.
Yeah, I think what you're saying probably sounds familiar to anybody who's been working remotely for the past 3 months. So you're really saying we should have a lot of confidence in Congress to work through these issues.
Yeah, What I'm saying is Congress is functioning, and I think that it's important, especially during a crisis. I think it's important that all levels of our government work. Now, some have said, well, you should have to just encourage to all meet in person, and the hell with social distancing and whatever. I mean, we also need to lead by example. And if we're asking people to wear masks, like we all, I have my Patriots mask that I wear. If we're all wearing masks and we're telling people to social distance, and we're not, that's not leadership. And the other thing is, I feel well, but I may be a carrier, an asymptomatic carrier. So my, intermingling with a whole bunch of people in the Capitol, from everybody from my staff to, fellow members of Congress, to the Capitol Police, to the people who are working in the cafeterias. I mean, I could be spreading this, if I'm not careful. And so, what we have to do is what makes sense, follow the best medical advice. And I think we're doing that, and also protecting the integrity of the system and people's confidence in Congress.
That's great. So I have one kind of final wrap-up question, and then I want to move on to some questions by Rachel Cobb. And that is, now having said that we should have confidence in Congress functioning, sort of what's next in congressional action to help with the pandemic and the economic fallout. And then we're going to pivot to Rachel, who is going to ask how the COVID crisis has really impacted your ability to represent your district, or Congress people's ability to represent their districts.
Well, I think you should have confidence that Congress can function. Whether it functions well or not is a whole another story. Look,
so you're going to come back for another webinar.
We have. Look, we've passed some important legislation to help deal with the immediate crisis. The CARES Act was the last piece of legislation that went through the House and Senate and signed into law by the president. Provides direct more assistance to our small businesses, help with unemployment compensation, money for PPE, and a whole range of other things. On May 15th, the House passed what we call the HEROES Act, which provides additional relief, including direct aid to cities and towns which are suffering because of the economy shutting down right now. Unfortunately, the Senate hasn't taken that up yet. And I'd hoped that they would have taken it up before July 4th. They didn't do that. I hope that they take it up before they recess for August. So we need to address that. And there are other things, to deal with the immediate crisis that we're going to have to deal with. And so we will take them up in the House. I believe we will pass them. Again, we have a Senate that for whatever reason doesn't want to do anything. And that is frustrating. And it is unfortunate, especially for the American people and for our economy. But we also need to think about not just the emergency, but how we get beyond this emergency. How do we get this economy going again? How do we rebuild our country? We just passed a major infrastructure bill, $2.5 trillion infrastructure bill in the House. Again, we've sent it over to the Senate. Whether they do anything or not with it remains an open question. But there are other important bills that we need to pass. Appropriations bills to keep government running. We're doing that in next week. So there are lots of things that we must do in order to keep government running, and then there are things that we should do to help this economy. And we're going to try in the House to do both. We just wish we had a partner in the Senate who would work with us.
All right. Well, now I'm going to turn the floor over to Rachel, who has some questions about how you're functioning during COVID in representing your own district and listening to the needs of your constituents.
Thank you, Christina. As everyone well knows, this is an election year. And so much of how politicians campaign is by going to places and meeting people and shaking their hands and listening to them. And some of those are, you go to the senior center or to the barbecue, but you really get a chance to meet people that you wouldn't normally meet. So now everything is turned upside down. And I wonder if you can talk about the impact that it has had on you and your ability to campaign, on your colleagues' abilities to campaign, and what that means in terms of who you are hearing from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a good question. Look, anybody who's involved in politics, finds this current moment really strange and awkward because we're so used to dealing with people in person. You mentioned barbecues and parades and town hall meetings and coffee parties in people's homes and now we're communicating like this. I'm doing Facebook Live town halls. I'm doing Instagram Live question and answers. I'm doing teletown halls to try to reach as many constituents as I can. And I also again just like I pointed out that there are members of Congress who there's a learning curve in terms of technology. The same with the general population. Not everybody, communicates the way we're communicating now, or can. And so, we have to, I can use this kind of platform to reach a certain number of my constituents, but I also have to be sensitive that there are some, who don't feel comfortable with this. And so that's where the teletown halls are, and, where I talk to people on the telephone. We're obviously trying to answer as many letters and emails and texts as we get. And, people are calling my office. Most of my office is working remotely, but we are returning people's calls, trying to get people information. But it's been a challenge. And as we get into this, full-blown campaign season, after Labor Day, it's going to be even more of a challenge again, because all of us who are running for re-election or running for the first time, how do you meet voters? I mean, I can't stand out in front of the supermarket or the post office like I normally would to shake hands. I have to, I got to practice social distancing. I can't shake people's hands. So it's just different, but we're all adapting, and we're trying to, again, learn the different platforms that different age groups and different segments of our society, rely on for information and communication. So every day I learn something new, and I learn about another platform that I should be, engaged in, and it's challenging. But we're doing the best we can.
So I have a follow-up question to that specifically, and then another question about voting in general and what that's going to look like, and how you're going to message that with your constituents. But first, so have you had encounters with people at the supermarket, and what has that been tricky to navigate?
It has, because some people have come up to me to try to, shake my hand, or I had a woman come up to want to give me a hug, and I was like, I had to say, we'll do this, or let's just wave, but because we have to follow the rules here, and if I don't follow the rules, then other people are watching and saying, why aren't you following the rules, but asking us to follow the rules. And I've had some encounters, positive and negative, in the supermarket, where people have, said, oh, thank you for the work you're doing, or, or I have a problem with, getting this check, or I'm having a problem with this agency or whatever, I'll take their phone numbers and I'll get back to them. And I've also had people who, who don't like me, who, will chew me out in a supermarket, and, that's their right. You do have those accounts, but again, it's I'm not in crowds a lot. I mean, I'm not, other than going to buy my food, or if I'm getting gas at the gas station, or if I'm mowing my lawn, sometimes people will walk by and stop and, ask questions. Most of my communications with people have been, on platforms like this, or on the telephone, or emails or texts, or yeah. So it's just different.
So final set of questions just around voting, and there will be vote by mail in Massachusetts, although lots of things still to be worked out. Because there will also be early voting for the primary. A lot of information has changed from the last time people voted. And perhaps polling places will indeed close. There is going to be a lot of confusion. And I'm sure your office is gearing up for that, both as a member of Congress, sort of discussing this writ large, but also about how you're going to manage it as a campaign. So what are the things that, this could go anywhere really, but what are the things that you think are absolutely necessary for towns and the state to do to try to help everybody to have correct information?
Yeah, well, they're going to have to spend some money and actually provide people that information by way of mail. And if there are other appropriate, platforms that they utilize, every town is different, every city is different. They ought to utilize that as well. But that's, and I mentioned the HEROES Act that we passed in May. We included in that, a significant amount of money for states and cities and towns to be able to do what they need to do to make it easier for people to vote by mail. Nobody should have to risk their life to cast a vote. And I think, we're going to have to, again, we're doing that in Massachusetts. You have the option of you could apply for a mail-in ballot. I would say that you should be able to just have the ballot and, without having that extra, layer of activity that you have to do to get it. But in any event, but we also going to have to realize that for some people, voting by mail is not an option, and we're going to have polling places open. We're going to have to do whatever is necessary to accommodate everybody's needs. That's the whole point of voting, is to make sure that everybody who wants to participate can vote, and nobody should not be able to should not vote because the system is set up in a way that disadvantages them. So we're going to have to do everything, and so lots of information is going to have to go out. But it's important that, again, we give people options, and this should not be controversial. Unfortunately, it has become controversial. The president who votes by mail is decrying voting by mail. It's okay for him and his wife and his kids, but it's somehow it's not okay for Mrs. O'Leary or Mr. Jones or whatever. That's just again, we're dealing with a deadly pandemic that has already killed over 130,000 people. Millions of people have been infected. This is serious, right? And we all have to try to figure out how to operate within this pandemic, based on the best medical advice that's out there, and that should include making sure that you can vote safely and by mail. And the federal government should provide the resources to help states, cities, and towns be able to pay for it.
Well, thank you. I am now going to shift this over to Arjun Singh, who is going to engage with our members of the audience and the lots of questions that have come in. So, Arjun.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us today. So for this next portion, we're going to first hear from 4 students. They're going to ask their questions themselves. Then we'll field some questions over from the audience. But Congressman, let me start off by just asking you, Rachel talked to you a little bit about how campaigning is changing from the side of voters getting to speak with you. In today's environment where we don't have the barbecues, we don't have the garden or the farmers markets anymore that people can go to, it seems like there's going to be a higher emphasis on digital advertising, social media, and television. Do you think that could unfairly benefit people who have more campaign war chests? And I guess what role do you think money, which has always played a big role in elections, is going to play in this election in particular?
Yeah, the answer to your question is yes, I do. The good news is that advertising on some of the digital media is a lot cheaper than some of the traditional, network TV advertisements. But again, it rewards somebody who can actually pay for an ad versus somebody who can knock on, 100 different doors. Now, there's other ways to communicate, on the various platforms, to be able to get to people, directly. But again, not everybody, has a Twitter account. Not everybody, looks at Facebook. Not everybody looks at Instagram. Not everybody, and for a lot of older voters in particular, they still rely on somebody knocking on their door or, getting a leaflet. So yeah, we'll see how it all plays out. The digital media has proved to be very, very powerful in trying to help some insurgent candidates, win races. But I do worry about money in politics. I have from the very beginning. I hate raising money. I really do. I became the chairman of the Rules Committee, and I just like people saying, you need to do more fundraisers. I don't like it. I think there's too much of an emphasis on money in politics, and I think it's corrupting the system. When I became chairman, one of my first announcements was that I no longer accept corporate PAC money. I mean, my staff went crazy, but it's like it's probably not anytime soon that Congress is going to change our campaign finance laws, unfortunately. So you got to lead by example. So I don't take corporate PAC money, but there are a lot of candidates out there raising lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money, and and they will mail their views, and they will pay for ads on digital media and on TV and whatever to get their views out. But look, one of the great challenges for everybody on this call, as we look to the future, is how you take money out of politics, because I really do. I think that's one of the biggest threats to our democracy. And I've been in Congress for a long, long time now, longer than I ever thought I would be. And money plays too big a role in too many decisions, and we got to take that issue on.
Let's go over to our first student question. Her name's Lexi Burke. She's an incoming freshman who's planning on studying biology. Lexi, welcome.
Hi, Lexi.
Thank you, Arjun. So this question goes to Representative McGovern. On June 9th, 2020, Nabil Rajab was conditionally released from a 4-year prison sentence after speaking out against the Bahraini government. Regarding his case, you were quoted saying, "His arrests and convictions have been for speaking out about injustices in Bahrain and criticizing the government. These are things that should never be a crime, and no one should be in prison for political reasons during a pandemic. With this and the upcoming election season in mind, what is your opinion on the arrests of roughly 9,000 protesters across the United States, many of which were nonviolent offenders during the COVID-19 pandemic?"
So thank you for raising Nabil Rajab's case. I co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and we have lots of people all around the world who are in prison because of what they believe and who they are, and it is wrong. And all of us who care about human rights ought to raise our voices on their behalf. And the same is true for those here in the United States. People who are involved in peaceful protest, who have taken to the streets, protesting the really serious issues that confront this country, like systemic racism. We should not arrest them. There's a difference between nonviolent protests and violent protests. But as you point out, the overwhelming majority of people who protested did so nonviolently. And I myself joined some of those protests. I'm worried about people in this country being punished for their political views. And we have to be very, very careful about that, because that's what happens in authoritarian regimes. That's what happens in countries that don't care about human rights. And that's one of the reasons why I was really upset with the president's stunt in which he basically took the military through Lafayette Square and tear gassed peaceful protesters so he could do a photo op in front of a church holding up a Bible. I mean, that is not the America that I believe in. And I share your concern about those who are arrested simply because, they had the courage of their convictions and spoke truth to power.
Next up, we have Aaron Byrne, who's from Littleton, Massachusetts. He'll be an incoming sophomore who's majoring in law. Aaron, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Regine. Congressman McGovern, recently you've made the following statement. By the way, they were not looters. They were patriotic Americans who were just sick and tired of racism in the country at every level. What would you consider the damages done to businesses of all sizes during times of protest that were already negatively impacted from COVID-19 if they were not looted?
Well, there was some, I was talking about the overwhelming number of people who protested. The president referred to them as looters and other negative terms. I think they were patriots. I think standing up against systemic racism in this country is the patriotic thing to do, is the right thing to do. And I think, so I give those who protested, those who continue to express themselves, great credit for that. Yeah, there were some people that were involved who, quite as we're learning now, had nothing to do with with Black Lives Matters or any of the organizers of the protests, who were criminals, who were there to disrupt. By the way, we're finding out some of those who were there to disrupt were people on the far right who wanted to make the protesters look bad. Look, I don't condone violence of any kind. My heroes are, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Archbishop Oscar Romero, Martin Luther King, Gandhi. These are, John Lewis, people who believe in nonviolence. I don't believe in destroying people's property either. And I think we should help those who had their properties destroyed to rebuild. But I will not be silent when protesters who are standing up against systemic racism in this country are being labeled as unpatriotic or as looters or as criminals. They're not. Any more than John Lewis or Martin Luther King should have been labeled that way. These were people who actually protested to move this country forward. We got the Voting Rights Act and we got the civil rights legislation passed. We need to continue that struggle.
Next, we have Elida Benoit. She's coming to us from Brunswick, Maine, but she's an incoming freshman over at Suffolk. Elida, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun. My question is, the pandemic put a pause on in-person voting and electoral rallies, forcing people to find a social distancing equivalent. How do you expect the new medium to affect the results of polls? How will you reach the population that do not have access or high comfort level to internet?
Well, that's a good question, and we're going to have to figure this out. Right? One is we're going to voting by mail is one option. Two, we're going to have polling places open, and we're going to have strict rules about how people can conduct themselves when voting, and protecting the poll workers who are there. And again, the challenge is going to be communicating with everybody. As I said to a previous question, we're having this conversation right now, but there are big chunks of people who live in my district who don't have a laptop, who wouldn't know how to, have this kind of conversation. And so, this conversation, they don't get to see. But we have to take that into account when we're getting people information, and when we're trying to figure out what are the steps we're going to take to implement a voting system that is fair. Look, my biggest worry about voting, in the upcoming election is voter suppression, and people, exploiting this pandemic to try to make it more difficult for people to vote. And that is what I'm very, very worried about. Again, that's one of the reasons why I want the Senate to take up the HEROES Act, which we passed in the House, because there is money in there to help states, cities, and towns be able to work out all the kinks and make sure that they have a system in place that can accommodate everybody.
And finally, to end our student portion will be Elaine Trunk. She's an incoming freshman who's planning on studying.
Thanks, Arjun. Congressman McGovern, I applaud you for your hard work helping families afford college by increasing funding for Pell Grants. However, low-income families are struggling economically. What is it you can do to help my generation, who are the future of this economy, afford college? Additionally, how can my peers and I best be engaged to help support these efforts? If we can't afford college, what's next?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Look, it comes down to political priorities. What we value and what we want to invest in. And I do think that we ought to be investing more in the education of young people and even not so young people all across the country. After World War II, Congress passed this thing called the GI Bill, which enabled all those who served in the war to get a free education. Millions of people did. It costs a lot of money. But I think any economist would tell you that whatever we invested in that program, we made back. We helped create a competitive economy with a well-educated workforce. And it trusts us to be the economic superpower of the world. We need to understand that. You getting an education is not just good for you, it's good for me. Because you're getting an education, the likelihood of you getting a job that pays a decent wage has increased because of your degree. You'll develop an expertise in a certain area. I mean, some of you may, major in biology, and you'll find a vaccine for some future virus. Some of you are going to be, writers and write, the next great novel or whatever. Some of you are going to, become lawyers or teachers or social workers. And so it's like, we need to do it. Now, look, I mean, there's all kinds of proposals out there. But my view is that, we ought to incentivize students either through more grant assistance or using the tax code to be more generous. I mean, people talk about free education. I'm just trying to think about what is within the realm of reality in my lifetime, given the makeup of Congress. But I do think that that education has to be more of a priority, and especially during this pandemic. We not only have to, I'm going to tell you, we not only have to think about how we help you get afforded school, and everybody's having economic difficulties, but also colleges and universities that have lost revenue. How do they continue to be able to remain alive until things kind of get back to where they used to be?
Great. Thank you so much to all of our students. Next, let's move to the question and answer portion. We have a lot of questions from the audience right now. Just a quick note, we won't be able to get to all of them today, but our Suffolk professors are working very hard to answer all of your questions. So hopefully if it doesn't get asked by me right now, you'll be able to get an answer. Congressman, let's start off with one question that was posed by, is that there have been several people inside the House who have said that they're not comfortable with remote voting, and as you touched on earlier, because the Constitution has a requirement that members must be present. Grace wants to know, why are so many people so hung up on the exact language of the Constitution and want to adhere to it so strictly, especially considering that it was written in a time before Zoom, the internet, computers? Right,
and but you can't. My argument is, I am present when you're present. I'm present. I mean, we're operating. We're at different locations, but we're present. Look, to be honest with you, I'm going to be. I think the real opposition to remote voting has nothing to do with the Constitution. The Republicans have filed a court case against it. We'll see whether that goes anywhere. But I'm pretty confident that it will withstand the constitutional test. I think people are opposed to remote voting because, and in this case, it's the Republicans, because they're not interested in the House actually accomplishing anything or doing anything. I mean, we have some Republican members who want to vote remotely, who have actually established proxies that they want to vote for them, only to have the House Minority Leader call them personally and say, please don't do that because it goes against our message. So essentially what the Republicans are saying to their members is that if you are from a COVID-19 hotspot and you can't get to Washington, then your 800,000 constituents cannot have a voice in congressional proceedings. I just think that's wrong. I think the opposition to this is more political than it is substantive.
Outside of the politics, though, a lot of work in Congress is legendarily done in these cloakrooms, very close corners meetings with each other. You guys can't be close to each other anymore. You have to do things far apart. How has the actual work of legislating changed so far in terms of what you've had to do, and how do you think it's going to change if this pandemic continues maybe for another 7 to 12 months going forward? How are you guys going to be able to replicate that famous style of legislating?
Yeah, and one is I hope we can get back to that. I mean, right? I mean, what we're doing with remote hearings and voting remotely by proxy is not meant to change the way Congress operates permanently. It's just for dealing with this current emergency we're in. But look, it's challenging. I mean, we're conversing a lot more on the telephone, and And that's better than not conversing, but it's not the same as me looking you right in the eye and having a heart-to-heart conversation. The other thing is that I chair the Rules Committee, which my old boss Joe Moakley did. We're like the traffic cop of Congress. We do a lot of different things, including we determine what amendments can be made in order to be debated on the floor. So, for example, we had an infrastructure bill last week. 370 amendments were offered, and a lot of them were all good amendments. Now we couldn't, bring the bill to the floor and have 370 different votes. We'd be voting until next year. So what we did is we came up with a solution. We decided to unblock them. In other words, put a bunch of them together. So his 30 amendments were, you could debate them, but you're gonna vote for them all in one big block. And so we were able to accommodate, quite a few of them. And we're gonna have to do that with the defense bill and the appropriations bills coming up. It's not perfect, but the alternative to that is just have a closed rule and say you can't offer anything. So again, we're trying to thread the needle here and to try to find ways to make sure that your views as members can be heard, but that we also understand what the reality is in terms of how we have to operate with this COVID-19 pandemic.
And just like you guys have to vote differently, we're all going to have to be voting differently come November. Right. Kentucky infamously shut down more than 90% of their polling locations, citing the pandemic. Whatever happens as the outcome of this election, how do you think that we can ensure legitimacy in the eyes of the public, that these elections were fair and that the results need to be upheld?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. We've passed some legislation in the House that the Senate hasn't taken up that prescribes some steps that we should be taking to secure our elections. That was even before the pandemic. I mean, I still worry about Russian interference in our election. We know from our intelligence briefings that Russia is already doing what they did in 2016 and trying to rig the outcome of this election. We have a president who asked China and Ukraine to get involved in helping rig this election. So we need some better checks and balances in terms of the security of our election systems. During the pandemic, we need to make sure that, again, every available option is there for people so that there's no excuse for people not to be able to cast their vote. And then we're going to need to update the voting rights laws in this country to prevent the kind of suppression that we have seen through election after election after election after election, where you have people, you have conservative secretaries of state who make it more difficult to vote in urban areas or in communities of color, and make it easier to vote in white suburbs. I mean, we need to fix that again. But in the short term, we're going to have to provide the resources to the states to be able to make sure that every option is available for people.
We got one question over here is coming from Jeffrey. He's associated with the Massachusetts Disabled American Veterans Association. He'd like to know, in light of the pandemic, do you think that there should be substantial changes to the way soldiers' homes are run, maybe federalization under the VA system or reclassification as long-term care facilities?
Yeah, well, I think what he's referring to is what happened in Holyoke, and that is tragic. And the investigation that was done, I think, documented some incompetence and some negligence that really is unconscionable, especially given the fact that this is a place that housed our veterans, people who fought in our wars, who protected us, and who, put their lives on the line for this country. I don't know, whether federalizing it would improve it. I know the delegation is trying to figure out, ways that we can make sure that what happened in Holyoke never happens again. And I know the governor is working on some changes as well, and so we'll see. But clearly, business as usual is not an option, and so I'm for whatever will prevent this negligence from ever happening again, not only in Massachusetts but anywhere in the country.
And staying on that theme of oversight, Congress's role sort of as an overseer of the federal bureaus that the administers. As the president's messaging, for one, during the coronavirus increased partisanship, making it difficult for these agencies to do their proper jobs? And do you think that Congress has been able to effectively provide oversight to agencies like Health and Human Services?
Yeah, I think the president's messaging has made it very difficult for agencies to do their job. I mean, you see it during the weekly coronavirus briefing, where whether it's the head of HHS or Dr. Fauci or Dr. Bricks or the head of the CDC. I mean, they are sometimes tongue-tied trying to be able to deal with some of the outrages that the president tweets about. I mean, even on the issue of masks. I mean, this is not a. This is. That's my my ringtone. But he's made this a political statement. This is not a political statement. This is my mask. It's a Patriots mask, but it's not a political statement. I wear it to protect you, and you wear it to protect me. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, left wing, right wing. I mean, we all should, understand why we wear these. He's turned this into a political football that, if you wear a mask, that somehow you're making a statement against him. So that is frustrating. But put him aside for now. In terms of Congress's oversight, I mean, never before have we been in a situation where we've had an administration that has refused to comply so regularly with oversight questions. And so, yeah, we have done oversight, but not as effectively as I think Congress should do. And I think, God forbid, he gets reelected again. I think we're going to have to think of stronger penalties for the administration, for administration officials who do not comply with congressional oversight.
On that note of politicization of the science of this, I'm not going to ask you why the president does what the president does, but why have so many of your colleagues also taken up the mantle of using masks as political football, the virus as a political football, rather than sort of defer to what traditionally have been objective scientists on this part? Where do you think that's coming from within others outside of the administration?
Yeah, it's one of two things. It's either ignorance, or it's just deliberate misrepresentation of the facts, which is unforgivable in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, the president, is not eager in getting everybody tested. Yet, if you want to go see the president, you can't go to see him unless you're tested before you walk into his office. But for the rest of us, well, testing, we were doing too much testing, he says, or, I'm not requiring masks at indoor rallies. I don't know. It's this, maybe it's this appeal to people who just don't have, who don't like government or who have a distrust of government that, or don't like to be bossed around or whatever he's appealing to. It's just dangerous. And I have to tell you, there are lots of reasons why I think he's unfit for office, but this is high amongst them. Politicizing a pandemic. I mean, and by the way, the politicizing this began not just with the masks. It began, in December and January and February and in March when he was being told by his national security team that this is serious and we ought to prepare, and he chose not to. And that delay and that denial was deadly. We're told by a study at Columbia University, had we begun the social distancing and the shutdown of our economy a week earlier, 30 to 60,000 people would be alive today who are not alive today. So, yeah, I think he thinks this appeals to a certain group of his supporters. But leadership is not about just saying what your base wants you to say. Leadership is about leading, and sometimes that means taking a position and convincing people that they have to come to your side of the argument.
Let's move over to an area of policy. This was announced recently. Massachusetts has a lot of international students. There's a new federal guidance that says international students cannot be in the country if they're taking classes online only. What were your thoughts and what's your reaction to that?
It's disgusting and it's ridiculous, and but it's totally consistent with the president's anti-immigration stand on everything. I mean, it's like he thinks beating up on immigrants is a political winner for him. But I mean, I always, the international students who come to the United States to get a great education, whether it's at Suffolk or Harvard or Holy Cross or Clark University, wherever. I mean, they come here. Oftentimes, they contribute to our economy. They are active and valued members of our community. We learn from them. They are oftentimes they may decide to stay here. They may take the expertise and the education that they gained here and want to put it to work here in the United States to strengthen our economy or to find cures for some of the diseases that are out there. But I hate the way he has taken to dehumanizing people. And also, I think there's a racist element to this as well. And sometimes we forget we're all a nation of immigrants. I mean, my family is not indigenous to North America. In fact, let's not forget that the people who are truly the people who are entitled to claim this land as their land are the Native Americans who have been whose rights have been taken away and whose land has been stolen from them. So, I mean, we ought to be cognizant of history, but we ought to not buy into his demonization of immigrants.
A lot of Americans right now, a lot of businesses were helped out financially, particularly in PUA assistance that was going to unemployment. That's going to expire at the end of July. We've had the PPE, the Small Business Administration loans. Can we afford to continue to prop up American businesses and taxpayers? Some on the right say that it's financially impossible. What do you think, Congressman?
I do. I think, yes, we can and we should. I mean, look, what's the alternative? To increase the amount of people who are hungry in this country, to increase the number of people who are homeless, to force students to drop out of college. I go right down the list of, we need to do whatever it takes to get us through this. When Franklin Roosevelt was president and we had the Great Depression and he came up with the New Deal, I mean, it wasn't some little, little tiny dinky plan to just nibble around the edges. I mean, they were big, bold, life-changing proposals. Look, we're in a crisis like none of us have ever seen in our lifetime before. And so we have to do whatever it takes to make sure that we get through it. And then we're going to have to invest some even more money to get this economy jump-started again, beyond just, holding the line. We need an infrastructure bill. We need to invest in more medical research. We have to, invest in housing and in, education and so on. So, no, I think we can afford it. I think we cannot afford not to do this. And so, and I always find it ironic that people who say we can't afford it are the same people that were okay with, going to war in Iraq, or they had no problem with deficit spending then, or when they want to increase the military budget to build more nuclear weapons, or a tax cut for billionaires that costs us trillions of dollars. They don't have a problem with that. Look, I think we have to do we have to do to help make sure we invest in our people, to keep them safe and to keep them whole through this pandemic.
Well, let's end on one last question from Hannah. She wants to know, as a sponsor of legislation that would replace a bust of Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney with one of Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, do you think there's a moral responsibility to keep the statues, particularly Confederate ones that are generating a lot of controversy. Should we be keeping those statues up to make sure that that history doesn't repeat itself?
No, so I mean, the statue that you referred to, I mean, he was the author of the Dred Scott decision, right? I mean, you know, he didn't believe that African Americans were citizens, were humans. I mean, a particularly egregious personality in our nation's history. The idea that he has a coveted place in the United States Capitol, I mean, that's who we're honoring. Or, you know, some of these leaders of the Confederacy, again, who championed slavery, who are guilty of treason and sedition. I mean, that those, now look, I'm not saying that we don't learn about these people in history. I mean, or that there not be museums or places where people can learn about them. But when you name a public square after them, where you have a position of honor for them in the United States Capitol, I mean, is that what we want to have our public squares named after? You know, I was in Germany a couple of years ago, and you know, there were no statues of Hitler anywhere in Germany. I mean, but Germans learn about the history, their history with Hitler, you know, as their leader. I mean, you know, they do that because he was a monster. And some of these people who have squares named after him, who have statues in the Capitol named after them, they're monsters. And look, I was a history major in college, and I always tell people that I wish people had more of a sense of history. And I feel that way now, even, you know, with you know, amidst all these protests and in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, because people don't know or appreciate our own history. They don't know the history of the Native Americans in this country. They don't know the history of slavery. They don't know the history of Jim Crow. They don't know the history. I go right down the list of, you know, of really horrific chapters. And, you know, and if you don't know your history, then you're, as Santayana once said, you're condemned to repeat it. And I think it's important that, you know, we, at this moment, as we're dealing with the pandemic and everything else, but, you know, especially with all the marches going on, this is a time for us to teach each other about history. And, you know, one of the things I would encourage, you know, colleges and universities to do is to be a forum where people can learn about, you know, our history, and learn about who some of these figures are, learn about who some of these people are who have statues to them, to honor them in the Capitol. Because I think this is an important moment in our country for a whole bunch of reasons.
Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time to answer some of our audience questions and our questions from students. Thank you to the members of the audience who submitted questions. I hope that you guys have enjoyed our talk so far. And I'm going to hand it over to Rachel now to tell you a little bit more and end it tonight.
Thank you, Arjun, and Congressman Jim McGovern. We want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, to graciously answer our questions and to help us understand these issues with greater depth. We certainly hope that we are providing the public square to learn about the historical issues that guide us to this day. And audience, we want to thank you for tuning in and spending this hour with us. Christina, what's up next week?
Up next week, we are going to have a conversation with Andrew Basevich about the militarization of U.S. policy, cost, consequences, and COVID. And I hope that we will see some of you back with us, or all of you back with us next week. And I'd also like to echo Rachel's thoughts and thank the Congressman for once again being so generous with his time. And I'd also like to thank our partners, WGBH and the Ford Hall Forum, for making this public platform and public survey course for everyone possible. Thank you.
And can I just say, I tune into Andrew Basevich. He is extraordinary. So I may tune in. So I mean, I'm a big fan of his. So
we'll send you a registration link.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting conversation.